is democracy need a critical update in the world?
Human rights is a number of different things, and I don't think there's any country in the world that would claim to have perfect human rights, or perfect democracy, or perfect anything. We would not be sitting here having this interview 2.5 years ago if I had gone to media outlets saying the British ambassador would like to talk about human rights, and as long as the government only listens to itself, the government isn't going to make the best policies.
But some journalists, they limit themselves with some topics, several topics. Is that a self-censorship, or do you believe that there is still censorship?
Well, look, I mean, speaking very frankly, one thing that one rarely sees, so far as I can remember, is any criticism of or the top ranks of government.
Inson huquqlari umumjahon deklaratsiyasi 10 dekabr kuni Birlashgan Millatlar Tashkiloti a'zo davlatlari tomonidan qabul qilindi va bu konvensiya keyinchalik butun jahon davlatlari va butun bir bashariyat, insoniyat uchun huquqlarni ta'minlovchi fundamental uning haq-huquqlarini e'tirof etib isbotlab beruvchi qonunga aylandi. Mana shu qonunni O'zbekiston ham qabul qilgan va u amalda e'tirof etiladi. Bugun biz ana shu kunning bayrami munosabati bilan Britaniya elchixonasida janob elchi Christopher Allan bilan suhbat uyushtiramiz. Good day to you. Assalomu alaykum.
Assalamu alaikum.
The 10th December is a date for the convention adoption in the world and the United Nations, and now Uzbekistan adopted it into practice. Worldwide, the countries, member states will celebrate it. The first question is that these world states, the member states, are rightful to celebrate it.
It's a good question. As you said, the 10th of December is UN Human Rights Day, and this year it's a very special one because it's the 70th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which is one of the most wonderful international agreements, international statements of values and principles in existence. So yes, we should certainly be celebrating it, but as well as celebrating it, of course, it's a time to think about how successful we all are in the international community in implementing those standards, those very, very fine principles enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights.
Because the most cases that fundamental human rights belongs to the democracy is democracy need a critical update in the world.
Human rights is a number of different things, and I don't think there's any country in the world that would claim to have perfect human rights, or perfect democracy, or perfect anything. So, you know, a lot of this is about countries helping each other improve their standards in these areas, particularly in line with the international conventions, the international commitments, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we have all, the United Nations family, said that we agree with. Looking at trends in the wider world over the last few years, you know, yes, I think there are reasons to be concerned that in some parts of the world we see that democracy is not as strong as it has been in the past, but also in some parts of the world there's good progress in human rights and democracy. One of those parts of the world is Uzbekistan, and I actually feel very lucky to have been working here over the 3 years I've been here, and to have seen the great improvements in human rights in this country in particular over that period. Which isn't to suggest that things are perfect here either, they're not perfect anywhere, but there have been significant improvements. But no, you're right, the global picture is one where democracies themselves, including mine, are struggling with various internal divisions, and one in where some countries have moved, I would suggest, away from democracy, including some of the biggest countries in the world.
The concept of human rights always speaks for the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of thought.
Indeed.
And is there any horizons of the borders of this freedom?
Yes is the obvious answer. So if we take freedom of speech as an example, freedom of speech is a fundamental human right. But in most countries, including my own, there is in the end some limit to that. And for us...
Where is that limit?
I'll tell you exactly. For us, the limit lies when you reach the stage of inciting violence or inciting racial hatred. Is that clear? So in other words, expressing any political opinion, any opinion on any issue is fine until you reach the stage at which you are encouraging other people to commit illegal violent, racist acts. That's when you've crossed a line into a criminal act. But that leaves, I would say, very, very wide scope for the expression of any kind of criticism of the state or the government or any other person or party, as long as you're not moving into something that is encouraging criminality.
Okay, and let's be clear. This year was so interesting and fulfilled with the cases and the conditions. Uzbekistan has faced many challenges, like a trial of Bobomurod Abdullah for detained bloggers, journalist Rauf Khan, and other cases. Did Uzbekistan pass at that examination very successful or not?
So, as I said, I think the first thing we need to recognize for Uzbekistan is that there have been very significant improvements in human rights, including in freedom of speech, over the last 2 years. We would not be sitting here having this interview 2.5 years ago if I had gone to media outlets saying the British ambassador would like to talk about human rights. I wouldn't have had anybody come back to me and say, oh yes, please. In fact, if I talked too much about human rights in an interview, it may not even have been published. But now we're having an interview exclusively about human rights, and we're talking very openly about freedom of speech, and that is in and of itself, I think, a very positive signal. It's not about, I think, passing or failing any particular test. It's about, at least in Uzbekistan, demonstrating progress, moving this space for freedom of speech more widely year on year. And I think we do see significant progress in that area. Not all of the steps are positive, and you've mentioned a few areas of concern. I'm currently certainly concerned about the lack of accessibility to major social media websites. Facebook in particular has become a really valuable forum for the expression of all sorts of views and debates in Uzbekistan. And the expression of those views, I think, is also very beneficial for the government because it allows them to understand, to get feedback from society on their policies. Indeed, many ministries and many government officials have Facebook accounts precisely to allow for that exchange with people. So it's very concerning, whatever the reasons, that Facebook and other sites are currently not accessible. And of course, it's not just Facebook. A number of other sites have remained inaccessible in Uzbekistan, including, for example, often BBC Uzbek or Ozodlik or Fergana, to name a few. And these also, I think, are able to offer some interesting viewpoints on context. And of course, many people access these sites anyway. So I would generally feel it to be to everybody's advantage for access to these sites to be freely available.
And last time we see that the condition human rights is not always about the citizen to government, but citizen to citizen in society. How do you see the rights of minorities in Uzbekistan, including the ethnic minorities and the religious minority people?
It's a good question. So I think there are many positives in this area to begin with. To take one example, teaching in schools in minority languages is not only allowed, but as I understand it, very much encouraged. The provision of textbooks and facility to learn in all of the languages of the country is quite free. That's not the case in every country. The regions are reasonably empowered to set their own agendas and take decisions about the allocation of resources within the regions themselves, so that's also positive. And of course, Pakistan, probably the most distinct minority area, has its own devolved parliament.
But when we talk about the human rights in Uzbekistan, mostly people understand that either this freedom of speech or either this freedom of religion. And do you see the progress in it?
So on freedom of speech, firstly, I think human rights is much broader than freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And people can talk about really quite a broad range of human rights, including economic and social human rights, as well as political rights. And we do tend to focus more on political rights. As I said, in freedom of speech, I see a great deal of progress. KUN.UZ is a great example of one of the websites which is really helping to create a much more lively debate around policies and politics. And this is something that the government has actively called for. You know, the president himself has encouraged journalists to be more critical. because he recognizes that through that criticism comes feedback, and as long as the government only listens to itself, the government isn't going to make the best policies. It needs to get the feedback from citizens, and the sorts of criticisms and suggestions that the media can help offer. We all know, the media is a crucial part of it's the fourth estate. It's one of the crucial pillars of a successful democratic society. And I think the President and the government recognise that and want to encourage the media to grow more. So look, I think this is all very, very positive. But there's still further to go, as there is in most countries. One thing we'd very much like to see is the accreditation of a BBC journalist here in Uzbekistan. It's an issue we've been raising for some time with the government, and despite some positive signals, we still don't have a positive answer, and we don't quite understand the reasons for that.
Still on waiting list.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. But some journalists, they limit themselves with some topics, several topics. Is that a self-censorship, or do you believe that there is still censorship?
I think it's a mixture of both. I think probably it's largely self-censorship. I'm not aware of any official government censorship, but I think that within the editorial chain of command within some parts of the media, there may be editors who don't want to take risks, who prefer to remove any critical content. And you ran an interview very recently with a journalist from Uzbekistan 24, who noted that exactly this problem existed, and that even the words of international speakers, probably such as myself, are sometimes changed in translation into Uzbek, which is of course something we were aware of and are disappointed by, and I very much hope that that practice will now stop. When internationals, as well as when Uzbeks, offer comment, I think it's more useful to hear their honest views rather than to hear what they what perhaps an editor would have liked them to have said.
I mean, is there a taboo topic for journalists, for all the society to discuss or to debate on?
Well, look, I mean, speaking very frankly, one thing that one rarely sees, so far as I can remember, is any criticism of or the top ranks of government. Criticism of government at all is a new thing in Uzbekistan, relatively speaking, for the media, so perhaps it's not surprising that people are limiting their critical comments so far. But certainly in my country, you can't pick up a newspaper without reading negative headlines about the government, and there's a balance here. But I think it would be a sign of a healthier media, would be a willingness to offer some critical comment even on the decisions of the president himself.
Everybody now speaks about that freedom, about that human rights, and complain on many cases, on many things. They complain about the judicial system. They sometimes speak about the unlawful attitude of police officers, and they complain to also journalists. Like they tell everything about the journalists. Do you think that the role of human rights activists in society is very active or inactive here? Do we need them? Do we support them?
So good questions. So firstly, let me say that, again, in this broad area of what I would call accountability of the government, there has been tremendous progress in the last couple of years. So the introduction of the virtualny priom within the first few months of President Mirziyoyev's time in office was a huge step forward in terms of accountability. Citizens now have the opportunity to give feedback direct to the government in various different ways. Citizens are consulted on new legislation online, Mining Fikrim exists, various different tools. The government is making a real effort to reach out to hear what citizens have to say. And this may not be perfect, but at least in very many cases, the government is also responding to what the citizens are saying. Now, you raised also the question of human rights defenders and their role in helping to raise issues of human rights concern. I think human rights defenders play a really important role in bringing a focus onto human rights issues, in raising issues of concern in any society. And let me say again, no society is perfect. In the UK, we are regularly criticised by international human rights organisations, by United Nations special rapporteurs on human rights issues. So I don't say this as somebody who's claiming he comes from the perfect country, but I do see scope in Uzbekistan for more space for the human rights defenders community to operate. It would be fair to say that this is a community that has struggled for many years. Quite a number of people working in the human rights area have been imprisoned over the years, and many of them have now been released. But it's clearly been quite a difficult area to work in. It remains a relatively difficult area to register an organisation, a non-governmental organisation, to work in. So working entirely legally in this area is quite difficult. When it's difficult to register your organisation, it's difficult to find a space to do your organisation's work. So these are certainly areas that the government, I think, could look at in order to give this community a legitimate way to operate that can very much be of benefit to the government. Now, the government is already working with this community. So a couple of weeks ago, was it last week? You may have been at the ILO's presentation of its preliminary findings on the monitoring of labour practices in the cotton harvest. And this year, for the first time, I think it's great credit to the government that they worked, as well as with the ILO, with human rights defenders in Uzbekistan to make sure that this independent monitoring took into account the views, the feedback, the information human rights defender community had. I see that as a very positive example and an indication that the same sort of thing may be possible in other areas of work as well. But yes, that requires finding a way to make it easier for human rights defenders and organisations to legitimately operate in the country, independent human rights organisations.
You mentioned about that elimination of forced labour of teachers, doctors, and many society levels. Do you say that the unique, standardized that human rights should have it, and what should it have in the food in Uzbekistan to eliminate?
Okay, so firstly, again, I'm going to start with a very positive trajectory on this issue. And this goes back quite a number of years in Uzbekistan. I think the government deserves a lot of credit for its strong focus on, firstly, eliminating systematic child labour in the cotton harvest, and now its strong focus on reducing the risk of forced adult labour in the cotton harvest. The ILO does a great job in working with the government, human rights defenders, the labour unions, the Chamber of Commerce, in monitoring the cotton harvest and in advising the government on how to further reduce the risk of forced labour. The trajectory is very positive. So year on year, this monitoring, as you will know, has suggested further reductions in the numbers of labourers, pickers, that say that they are forced. So this year, the figure of the preliminary results was 7% of the overall workforce. I think this is great. It's great news. It's very positive. And to be honest, we can't expect this problem to be solved overnight. I think the President has made very clear, the Prime Minister has made very clear that they want this practice to finish. But we also know that when it comes to the regions, when it comes to a local government official still has a quota that he or she needs to fill. There is a lot of pressure on them to effectively force, to pull in state sector and even private sector labourers to help pick the cotton when they need also to meet the quota. So those people are under competing pressures. And so in the end, resolving this problem requires a real transformation in the nature of the cotton economy, the rural economy, and the rural labour market, which it's not possible to deliver overnight. But what we say when we speak to the government about this is to please keep concentrating on the strong messaging from the top that this practice must end, and on making sure that the trajectory remains to reduce to zero as soon as possible. Because even 7% is still, as we heard a couple of weeks ago, something like 180,000 people a year working in the fields when they don't want to. They feel that effectively they're forced to do so. And of course, that's a very, very significant number of people to be working in conditions that are effectively involuntary or forced.
Okay, and let's step back to the topic of the democracy. What's the key elements of the democracy, and where we can see likely the good, better democracy in the world?
Where is a good democracy in the world? This is a great question. So I think in the UK we have a very good, strong democracy. You may be familiar with the words of Winston Churchill. Democracy is the worst system apart from all the others. Which is to say that democracy, of course, isn't perfect. And democracy has famously, in history, produced some very negative outcomes. But I'm personally, and my government is convinced that there is no better system, and that is also a principle at the heart of the United Nations. I think British democracy works well because I think we have a
What made it better democracy in the British society?
An incredibly vibrant media, firstly. Secondly, the strong checks and balances we have in our system. So we have strong and independent courts that nobody seriously
influence on it.
I'm not aware of any significant suggestions of corruption or political influence over the British judiciary. So them being independent from the government, I think, is also an extremely important strength. Now, we have a rather unique system of constitutional monarchy, dating back for a very long time. It works for us. It's not easy to transfer this model elsewhere. We don't have a written constitution, but suffice to say that it also provides an important extra guarantee, if you like, of democracy and power in the United Kingdom. And then we have a very vibrant parliament and a very competitive political scene. You know, the fact that in the UK we have held a referendum on Brexit, I think is an advertisement for, in many ways, the strength of our democracy, as is the fact that we have a government, a civil service, which proceeds to implement the decision of the people without question and with commitment, which is certainly what I, as a civil servant, very strongly feel. Okay, and
to make it conclude all our interview, how do you see that condition of human rights in the next 5 years in Uzbekistan?
Well, I look at Uzbekistan's national development strategy, which I think is an impressive and a very positive document. I have said so many times in many interviews, and I mean it. I think there is a lot of really positive stuff in the national development strategy, and as more and more of it gets implemented, I remain very optimistic about the country's direction as far as human as well as economic and social rights is concerned. I think as far as democracy is concerned, it will be very interesting to see how next year's parliamentary elections go in Uzbekistan and see how much debate and competition there is between the various parties involved. As far as labour rights is concerned, I'm personally convinced that the government will remain committed to transforming the cotton labour sector and to achieving further progress towards reducing to zero this problem of forced labour in that sector. As far as freedom of the media is concerned, again, I'm very optimistic. It's great that we're having this interview, and it reflects generally, I see, as I meet representatives of the media, as I do my work, they ask me, you know, tougher and tougher questions. And I very much welcome that because, you know, I enjoy debate, and why not be open about it and criticise each other, but we all become stronger as a result. So again, I'm optimistic. I hope that as I said earlier, more access can be achieved for foreign news organisations like the BBC to Uzbekistan. I think Uzbekistan has a lot to gain from more foreign journalists coming here, because almost all the articles being written about Uzbekistan in the international media are currently very positive. So welcome those journalists and allow them to be accredited here. I think also, you know, fuller access to the internet will be important. So I hope the problems currently facing Facebook and other sites are quickly fixed.
And it will never happen again.
Let's see. So yeah, I'm very optimistic in almost every respect. Another area we haven't really talked about is treatment of detainees, but we've seen the releases of a very significant number of prisoners of concern to us. That's been hugely important for Uzbekistan's international reputation, and I think the government deserves great credit for proceeding to do that in reasonably quick time. We've seen significant announcements on the transformation of the National Security Service, creation of the State Security Service, the introduction of closed-circuit television into detention facilities, cameras for policemen. All of these are really important steps as far as human rights are concerned too. So, there's much to welcome, and I remain optimistic about the trajectory over the next few years.
Mr. Allan, it was my pleasure to have that interview. Wonderful talks and thoughts and comments on this human rights issues and fundamental topics of Uzbekistan.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it too.
Thank you.
Cheers.